Hello lovely folks, and welcome back to Weird Kindred. Today we are going to be talking about cutting out the pieces for your simple tunic or dress. Doesn't matter which you're making, the method is exactly the same, the only difference is the length. Now hopefully you have watched the equipment video, which you can find here, so you know what you need for this stage, and you've also got yourself made a pattern diagram and a cutting plan that's going to work with the shape and size of your fabric. If you've got both of those things, you're ready to go. Brilliant. Today we're going to start with the underdress. I'll take you through cutting that out first, and a little bit later I'll run through a couple of bits that are a little bit different with the wool dress at the end. I'm going to be cutting out my linen underdress and my wool overdress at the same time. I would suggest you not do this. Get your undergarment cut first, get it sewn up, and make sure you're happy with the fit before you cut into your more expensive wool. Trust me. Now there are a couple of different ways that you can go about cutting your fabric. Some people with big living rooms prefer to lay it all out, mark the whole thing out with a fabric pen, something like that, and then cut around those lines that they've marked. I do it a little bit differently. I use my cutting mat and my rotary cutter and my rulers to mark out the area that I want to cut, and I'll show you how I do that today. We'll fast forward through most of it. You'll just get an idea of how to do it, because especially when you're first starting, dealing with 3 meters or so of fabric is quite difficult. The main things we're going to be looking at in this video, whichever method you choose, are the markings that you should put on your pieces once you've got them cut out, and a few little bits and bobs that are going to make it easier as we go along. So we're going to get started with cutting the linen underdress. Let's go. Okay, so the first thing I need to cut is my main body piece. I've got my pattern diagram all ready to go with all the different sizes for both dresses. It looks a little bit of a mess, so I won't show you that one because it's a bit confusing, but it has different options depending on which way I wanted to go with each dress. These are going to be my working peasant clothes. I'm going to be doing my dirty jobs in, therefore I've chosen to go with wider sleeves that I can push up to the elbows. Now there are some slight differences in the method when you are joining the gussets to the gores at the top, when you're doing full body long gores, and when you're choosing to have your gores stop at the waist. So we're going to do one of each. The underdress will have the long gores that come all the way up to the gusset under the arms, giving you plenty of room. And then the overdress will have its gores starting at the waist to give you a slightly more fitted shape. So with my pattern diagram ready to go, I know exactly what I'm going to be cutting. Before I start cutting, I'm going to be checking my fabric over just once more for any faults or flaws that may be in the fabric. The nature of linen is that you will sometimes find a few little odd bits, but most of those can be worked around. Now this is the fabric, you probably won't see it from that distance, that has the strange watermark on it. So I'm going to be cutting this one a little bit differently to how I would normally go about it, because there's a whole chunk down the side I can't really use for clothing. However, I will be able to use it for other things later. Because I really don't want to be down on my knees on the floor to cut this long main body piece, and I'm cutting it in one single piece for this garment, not 2 pieces, there's quite a lot of fabric to manipulate. So in order to cut it accurately, I'm going to be folding the fabric and then measuring the folded fabric and cutting that out to ensure I get the correct measurements. So because I'm folding, I'm going to need 2 additional measurements. The full length of this single body piece is going to be 112 inches. Half of that measurement is going to be 56 inches and a quarter will be 28. And I'm going to need those figures as I go along to make sure that I'm making the cuts exactly where I want them. So I'm going to take my tape measure, I'm going to start it just in from the edge of the fabric to give myself a little bit of leeway. Because I've done a cutting plan, I know I've got about 20 inches of extra fabric at the bottom of this piece before I need to move on to my other piece. So I'm very happy that I can just crack on like this. So the first thing I'm going to do is measure out 56 inches along. That's about there. It doesn't have to be terribly precise at this stage because you can manipulate this later and work with it to get it absolutely correct. What you want is a vague approximation so that when you come to fold it again, as you see, I'm now taking this and folding it into two. So there is the full length of my main body piece. Now to fit it on my cutting mat, I need to fold it again. So we're going to come from this corner here. This is going to be the shoulder seam of your final finished main body piece. And we're going to measure down 28 inches. That's about there. Now, what you may want to do at this stage, especially because we're working with a nice neat selvage, is clip the fabric along that edge so that it doesn't come out of line as easily when you're laying it on the board to fold it in half. I'm going to grab some clips now. Before I start clipping, I'm just going to start smoothing out the fabric, making sure I'm happy with how it's laying. Because if it's all laying a bit wobbly, it's not going to cut as neatly. Now, this has been pressed, but as you can see, linen creases like nobody's business. So we have got a few creases in there as we're working, but those ones aren't going to be a problem. It's the really big, thick folds you've got to watch out for. So I'm going to check that my edges are lined up nicely, because what we don't want is this to be at an angle when we've finished. I've got out a handful of clips to work with. Lovely. So I'm going to start roughly in the middle. Have a look how that all feels as I go along. Sliding it down, just making sure that these edges line up nicely. Many a time you'll think you've got it right and you end up having to start all over again. Just persist and you'll get a feel for it after a while. Now, there are some folks, rather than do this, will pull a single thread out of the garment, follow it all the way along, and then measure and do the same again, and that gives you your two lines to cut on. That's another method of doing it. I don't know why I don't use it, it's just never been something that I've needed particularly, but it is a technique that you can use should you want to. You've probably seen Opus Eleni and Bernadette Banner doing it, because they make incredibly precise, beautiful things. So I'm fairly happy with that end. I'm going to move back up to the other end and see how we're going. Now I've got some clips in place that should keep it all working nicely together as I fold it. I'm ready to make the next fold into quarters. So I am going to locate my tape measure and measure out 28 inches along this edge. Just there. And I'm going to mark it in the selvage where it's not ever going to get seen with a pencil. That is the line we're going to fold this to in order to get our correct piece length. So I pick up the whole lot, let it dangle so that it's falling naturally into place. Firstly, I come halfway to that mark and then I run my fingers down, hold on to the other side, again get that laying nicely. Lay it all out flat, make sure that there is nothing pulling on the fabric, nothing catching around the bottom of your table. Make sure everything is lovely and flat. Now, one thing that can be really helpful here, if you've got your long ruler, is to lay that along the fabric line that you're doing. So get a line along your cutting mat that you're happy with. Line up your ruler perpendicular. So you've got a nice edge to work to. Fold over that edge. Gently ease it into place, trying at all times to make sure that no odd folds or weird bits develop. That bit's trying to come across a little bit too far there. Then we'll lay it over. And a quick check here with our tape measure to make sure we're happy with the width. Just a little bit under the 28 we were looking for, only about 1/8 of an inch, but you've always got to be aware of that fold will change things ever so slightly. I'm going to move these clips so that they line up a bit neater, don't interfere with one another. And then I'm going to have a look a little bit further down and see now it's coming in. There's something ever so slightly off with that angle, so we're going to play with it a bit until we get it right. However, it's going to be a lot easier if we haven't got all of this extra fabric at the bottom hanging on it, extra weight. So because I know I've got 20 inches to play with, I'm going to cut along here, move that piece to the side, and then it'll be even easier to get this lined up just right. Back in a mo. So now we've got a piece a lot easier to work with, and what we're going to do is similar again for the other side. Now if you're working with fabric and you don't have very much to work with, you need to be more precise than this. In this case you just refold it and refold it until it was dead on the line and cut along there, and you wouldn't have any wastage. But if you've got a little bit to play with, and especially when you're just starting, it's worth buying a little bit extra so you've got some to play with, then you can do it this way. Now I know what my width is going to be. I'm going to measure half of that, fold it over, cut off the excess again, leaving myself a couple of inches to play with just to get everything lined up nice and straight when it's time. That's the excess, that's the bit with the weird stain on it. That's probably going to become a cover for my bow. Okay, so now our piece is substantially closer to the size that we actually want it to be. We're going to go back to that initial step and make sure we can line up everything nicely so we've got a nice even hem and straight sides. Okay. This bottom is 1/2 inch off what we expected, so that's 27.5 inches. Let's check the middle. It's exactly the same. And the same. So actually, this is a lovely neat fold, it's just not quite far enough over. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 27 and a bit. I'm going to fold our tape measure over. It brings us to 55 and 2/8 or 1/4, and what we want is 56. So we've got to find an extra 3/4 of an inch all the way down, and that will give us a beautifully straight hem. So what I'm going to do is use the guides on my cutting board here. Have it lined up nicely, make sure everything's where I want it to be, and then instead of cutting exactly next to here, which is quite tricky at times anyway, I'm going to cut 3/4 of an inch across that way to give us that little bit extra that we haven't got because it didn't fold completely, and then that's going to give us our length. Once that's done, we'll fold it in half again and we'll cut off the excess at the top to get the right width. back in a mo. I'm going to make a quick guideline here to cut to. And then once I've cut this bit, I'll move it all up and carry on. I'm happy that that's parallel because that line is exactly where I want it to be. I'm going to make the first cut. And that first stage is done. What I now need to do is very carefully fold this over and slide the whole lot up so that we can cut the other piece. Again, I've smoothed everything down. I've lined it up with one of the lines, so I'm absolutely certain that that is going to be a straight edge. Then I'm very quickly just going to mark a few more 3/4 of an inch markings down to guide me. Done. So this main body piece is now cut to the correct length. We need to trim some off to get it to the correct width. So I'm going to do similar to we did before. I'll leave those clips where they are for now. Grab a couple more to secure this lovely straight edge that we've cut. We know it's absolutely in line and where we want it, so we're not going to mess with that. So now we're going to fold it in half again. Now first of all we need to mark with our ruler, so we've got a nice fold line halfway across our main body width. I'm starting on number 1, so I'm going to add 1 to the number. And lay my ruler on there. Same from the other side. This is another reason why having 2 is really handy. Might not have seemed so a few videos ago, but this is where the double ruler comes into its own. Now I've done that wrong. I'm going to move that up and make the bottom of the ruler that line. And then I'm going to fold to the line, slide the whole thing down, unfold it, press everything back, make sure I'm happy. This is absolutely the longest and most complicated part of the process because you need to get it right. Once you've done it, you'll be really happy with the results. Okay, now we've got to square everything up before we make the final cut. So make sure that's nice and happy along that line. And everything's happy there. So we're going to add 1.5 and slide it down to 1. Got everything lined up where I want it to be. I'm going to check my fold. Now it's a little bit short again. Often when you're folding round it will take some of that length. Some of that length is in that fold already. It's not gone anywhere. It's in there. But what we're going to do, 1, so we don't mess up this line, and 2, just to give ourselves that 1/2 centimetre, 1/4 of an inch extra, is just cut just this side of that line. So first thing I need to do is just move these clips out of the way so that I can get a nice straight edge. I'm happy with that. I'm going to make my cut. Sometimes with rotary cutting there's a lot of moving around the table, so if you can do it in an area where you've got free movement, it's a lot easier. Now, when you're working with a rotary cutter, especially if you're doing multiple layers, sometimes you'll find that there's the odd bit that isn't cut through cleanly. So don't just try and pull your excess away, do it very gently and carefully, and make sure, that one went a bit wibbly, that everything's cut through before you pull, because that can pull everything out of alignment, and you don't want to come out of alignment. And in just a moment I'll show you why. Now, the last thing that we're going to do before we put this piece to one side is make a few little marks along the edges and along the top. They're going to act as guides for us once we start sewing up our work. First of all, I'm going to mark the midline. I will check this again when it comes to doing all the neckline pieces, but it's just handy to have a little mark there to give you some guidance. What I'm also going to do is mark the fold line of the shoulder. I'll do both sides, I'll go and do the other one in a moment, so that we always know where our midpoint is on that main body piece. If you were doing this with two pieces together, so you were going to be sewing along here, you'd still need to make those marks on the fabric, just 1/2 inch in, to mark your seam allowance, and make sure that everything is in line. Now, particularly important at this stage, if you're using two pieces, to pin everything together or use your clips. Make sure that's not going to move before you unfold it. When I unfolded this, I did it very gently, keeping everything in line. Once you've marked in your midline, the next thing that we're going to do is make a couple of marks along the edges on both sides and on both sides of the fabric. They're going to be there as guides for when we start sewing it all together. If you have a look on my pattern diagram template, you will see a greyed out area next to a label that says finished length of half sleeve and gusset. Now, these are points that we're going to be marking along here, so that when we're trying to match everything up as we do the sleeves, we've got a couple of points to compare to and check, so that we know we're doing what we expect it to be. So looking again at that diagram, at the bottom there, you'll see the gusset, the square piece that goes in under the shoulder. I cut those at 4. So for me, when I mark that in, that's going to be 3 inches. But the first thing that I need to do is calculate half of the finished length of the top of my sleeve. Now I'm going to cut the tops of my sleeve at 17 inches. That'll be a 16-inch finished circumference. So we need to measure 8 inches from the shoulder point down to mark that accurately. Now, we did this step as part of creating our pattern diagram template, but if you skipped it, that's why we're covering it again now. Adding those two numbers together gives us a total of 11 inches, and that's our finished length of half sleeve and gusset together. Now, because on this dress we're taking our gauze all the way from our gusset to the floor, we don't need to make any more marks, because that bottom mark at 11 inches down marks where our gauze are going to start. If you're starting your gauze from the waist instead, there's one additional mark that you'll need to make. Use measurement J1, that's your shoulder to waist measurement, and mark that distance down from your shoulder fold or from your stitching line if you are doing a two-piece body. So 8 inches. That's where my finished shoulder piece is going to go. Come off this way, that will be the arm. And then we're going to mark down another 3. And that point is the point at which our gussets will finish. Our gauze on this one are going to come right up to the top. I'm going to do the same on the other side of this piece. Just fold it over, lay my ruler on again, get everything exactly where I want it. Lovely. I'm going to do the same on the other side, and then we're going to have a set of marks that's really going to be handy when we're matching everything up. If you're like me, you're going to make a little mark on this shoulder line and then press with your fingers, make a nice crease. What I'll probably do is pop a couple of clips in there just to keep it exactly where I want it, until it comes time to put the neckline in. When you're working with a single body piece, it's really important to keep that line clearly defined. So now it's across to get that other side marked up. And again, I'm going to be marking both sides of the fabric. It'll help us keep everything nicely in line. And as I said before, if I was taking my gauze from the waist instead of under the gusset, I'd be adding that mark at the bottom as well. So I've done exactly as before, marking down the finished sleeve and the finished gusset. Ignore that bit, that's where I did it in a rush earlier and marked it wrong. Always measure twice and check carefully at this point, because it will really help you later on. As you can see, just gently pressing that with my fingers as I get some clips in place to make sure it stays put until I'm ready to work with it. Now, at this point, if you had two pieces, you would have already clipped them together, so they would be exactly where you want them to be. And what I'd suggest doing is very lightly move your clips out a little way so they're not going to interfere. Line up your top edge with your cutting board if you've got one, or if you haven't, just measure a few places along at 1/2 inch and add a really light guideline here to sew along. We'll cover this more in the sewing up your shoulders and cutting your neckline video. It's just something to bear in mind. It's a little bit easier to do now, sometimes before you've got all your clips in even, just to add that sewing line and make sure that it is equal all the way along. Now, the last thing that we're going to do before we move on to cutting the sleeves is make use of this rather excellently sized offcut that we took off when we were cutting the main body piece. It doesn't always work out quite as nicely as this, but in this case we have just the right amount to cut our gussets from. These are the squares that go under the arms. You need 2 of them. This fabric's doubled over, so I'm cutting 2 at the same time here. I'm just using my cutting mat to make sure I get nice neat 4-inch squares. Again, if you don't have a mat, just mark it out to draw along your guidelines. So we now have our main body piece and our 2 gussets ready to go. We just need to cut our sleeves and our gores. Let's do sleeves. The next thing that we're going to do is cut the sleeves. Now I cut my sleeves in pairs. I cut them all at once and I cut them folded to make sure everything is equal all the way around. I've started off with my piece of fabric folded over. I know I've got the width of an entire sleeve that way, and I know that I've got the length of the sleeve that way. A little bit of rough at the top. Don't know if you can see. Oh yes, you can see it. Excellent. That little bit is where the stain is. So I've just taken the fabric up to the stain, and then we've got plenty to play with. So I'm cutting my sleeves at 17 inches. That means I'm going to need to fold this in half to a depth of 8.5 inches. So I've got, oh yeah, nearly 10 there. And the same that end. Lovely. This line doesn't have to be exactly straight, but get it as close as you can because you want the grain to be running with the sleeve if you can. So first of all, we're going to cut the excess off here. Now, when I'm not doing this on camera, I move it right over and I use this area, but we're on camera today, so we're going to be awkward and a little bit different and cut at 10 so that you can see everything that I'm doing, even if it is a little bit awkward. Sorry about that. So I'm going to cut all the way just up to there. It doesn't matter if these scraps are still attached. I use the lines on this cutting mat to make sure when I can't see up there exactly where I am, I can just check with this one. But often when you're cutting, you can't see the top. So using the line, making sure you're exactly with it will help you get a nice straight cut along there. Before you do that, just make sure that you're happy that all of this is exactly on one of these lines. so that you know you've got a nice right angle here when you cut. Again, when you're ready to move your excess away, just do it really gently to make sure, oh, look, there's a little catch there. Now, if you'd pulled that too hard, you'd have pulled all of this out of place. So, little snip with your scissors, and there you've got your lovely 90-degree angle. Now, this is going to be the top of your sleeve. I'll show you what I do with the top of the sleeve before we go any further. You can see on the pattern template that I leave this top part of the sleeve here cut straight. I don't angle it in from this point, I angle it from here. So what we're going to do first is measure across how far that gusset will come. And in my case, I'm using a 4-inch gusset. So I'm going to make a mark 4 inches across right up here. Hang on. Oh yeah, I'm happy with that. That's where we're going to cut to. So first of all, we need the width of the top of our sleeve. Now, as I said, I'm cutting this at 17, so I need half of 17, which is 8.5. So I'm going to measure up 8.5 inches there. Then I'm going to line this up nicely along the bottom 4 inches, just there. Line it up with my top mark. Make sure it's nice and straight. Slide it down till it's 8.5. That's my pivot point, just there. So I'll be cutting along here. You can draw it in if you want to. You don't have to. You can just do it by eye when it comes to cutting if you want to, or you can draw it in if that makes you happier. So we've now marked off the top of our sleeve. Fantastic, we know where we're cutting to that end. What we're going to do now is move on to the cuff end. So firstly, we need the length of our sleeve piece, shoulder to wrist. This is where your sleeve length choices will vary. As we've talked about before, if you want a sleeve that's tight to the wrist, it really doesn't matter how long it is, because it'll all be rumpled up just here, no problem. However, if you want working sleeves that you're going to be rolling up, which is what I want for this dress, as it is my poor peasant dress, you're going to want to cut your sleeves a little bit wider. And this is where how long they are will make a lot of difference, because you don't want them dangling in things. On this dress, I'm going to cut my sleeves at 22. I may need to take a little bit off that before I hem them, but that's okay. It's always better to have a little bit extra that you can then tidy up later than not have enough. So we're going to mark out 22. So from 10 to 32. There we are. I'm happy at that. I've got everything lined up, nothing's moved. Please be really, really careful when you're using these, because they are wicked and they make very nasty cuts. So keep your fingers well out of the way. That's why it's often easier if you're doing it with a ruler and you've got quite a few layers to go through. That's why I've turned round and I appear to be doing this upside down, because that's how I'm most confident with the tool. So go upside down, go inside out, whatever you feel like, whatever works best for you and helps you to feel safe with your equipment. Now, that's not pulling too much, so I'm just going to leave that attached, because then I'll have a bigger piece of that scrap to play with later rather than cutting it off there. We're now going to mark the cuff width here. So on this one, I want nice baggy sleeves that I can easily push up to my elbows. So I'm going to cut this at 13 inches, which means I need 6.5 inches up this edge. Move that out of the way. Now, before I do anything else, just noticed that that's not where I want it to be. So I'm going to come back, just going to move that back exactly where I want it, so that I'm happy everything's in line. And then we're going to measure up our 6.5 inches on the cuff here. Now you'll also notice on my pattern diagram this little weird bit at the end of the sleeve where I take it back rather than sloping it up nicely to meet that edge there. I come back a little way before I start sloping. That is because when you're turning back these edges to hem your cuff, you want to be turning back onto something that's exactly the same width rather than trying to turn a smaller hem onto a slightly wider sleeve piece. Just makes it a lot easier when it comes to hemming these cuffs. Now, as I said, I may need to take a little bit off these sleeves. Usually I'd use 1 inch here. Today I'm going to use 2, just to give me that extra leeway when it comes time to hem that cuff. So now I'm going to join these 2 points, and I'm ready to cut both sleeve pieces out in one long cut. Now, as I say, you don't actually need to draw these lines. Just popping in these points, you can work with them absolutely fine. And that's what I tend to do. And I always use my ruler as I cut to keep me exactly where I want to be. Because especially, you're going through 4 layers here. It can be difficult to cut 4 layers sometimes, especially if your blade's getting a little bit blunt, which I fear this one might be. So, first of all, come into the edge. Yeah, that's all separated nicely, and I'm going to go all the way along, cut out these remaining pieces. There we have our 2 finished sleeve pieces. Now, before we do anything else, before we move them, I'm just going to finger press that corner in really well. Just make my mark at the very top so that I know the midpoint of the sleeve. I'm going to match this up to either the little bit on the shoulder. If you've got a single body piece, you'll just have a mark that's the middle of the shoulder line. If you've got a 2-piece body, you'll have a seam. And this little mark here is going to match up with that seam. The fold will be very visible anyway, but it's just nice to have a mark there. You can use whatever's appropriate. Sometimes I use my jolly purple pen, sometimes use a pencil. As long as you keep within about 1/4 inch, 1/2 centimetre, it's all going to be turned under when we fell it anyway. So none of these marks will show on the final garment. We don't need to mark the bottom, although you can do if you wish. You can make it a little bit easier when the time comes to line everything up nicely at the end when you're ready to sew up your sleeve piece. Two sleeves done. These now get folded up and put with the other bits, and we are ready to move on to cutting the gores. Okay folks, last but not least, we need to cut the gores. These are the pieces that are going to be inserted into the side of the garment to make it easy for you to move around. As I explained in the video on how to draw your own pattern diagrams, I cut my gores as 2 separate pieces for each side because it really saves a lot of fabric. What we've got here is the fabric folded over with just a little bit more than I need so that I can trim off either side. What we're going to do first of all is fold it again. So once again, we're working with fabric 4 layers deep. My handy length for cutting out with these gores is 46 inches. So I'm going to halve that, get 23, and then I know roughly how far along I need to fold this. So I'll slide it down a little way, because I'm probably not going to need all that extra space. That's on about 27, so if I stick that about there, fold to there, and I can see how much I've got. All looks utterly chaotic at the moment, but all will become clear. I'm just smoothing this down, getting it all where I want it to be. At this point, there's some layers underneath that aren't laying quite where I want them to, so I'm just going to take a minute to smooth them all out. So I'm very, very happy with the cuts that I'm making. Now, I want these gores to be 10 inches wide at the bottom. Because of how I cut these, and because I leave seam allowance at the top of each gore, I'm going to need to cut a rectangle 12 inches deep by 23, because when that's unfolded, that will make 46. So I'm going to start off by trimming away this bottom edge. This is where, if you're very short on fabric, you have to be a lot fussier and fold a lot more carefully to exactly where you need to be. But because I know I've got these little bits of extra, I can be a bit rougher with my cutting, which makes it a little bit quicker today as well. So if I take my cut line here, I'm cutting at 14. Means I'm going to be taking some extra off at that end as well. Make sure this fold is exactly on a line. Don't need to worry about whether this is straight anywhere else at the moment. What you're focusing on is getting a 90-degree angle with your cut here. It's not quite right there, so I'm just going to stop. Wait a minute. Smooth it again. Line that back up. Then I'm going to use both of my lovely long rulers to make sure I get an accurate cut. First of all, I'm going to use this as a guideline here to make sure that's looking good, and then I'll do the same again on the other end. Look at that, perfect. Now I'm going to cut all the way along there for our first side. So now we have our first edge. Now that's gone a little bit wonky donkey, but it's not too much of a problem. You can just ease that down so that we've got a little bit of excess there. That's not a problem. We're going to do the same again at the top now. And we're going to cut our pieces 11 inches deep. So we're going to follow the 12-inch line to cut the other sides, and then we'll trim the end off. See you in a mo. Now we're going to trim the excess off this end. So we're at number 3. We want 23 inches along here. So we need to cut at 26. Just a quick look. Yep, we're absolutely fine with this little bit here. We're going to cut at 26 and we'll have exactly what we want. So now we have our gores folded in half, and we need to unfold them and mark out the cut line because we're going to be cutting these into pairs. Now the first thing I do is I just finger press this edge so that I know where my exact middle is. That will be important in just a moment. So we're going to slide the fold line down to 23, and then keeping the two pieces together, we're going to unfold and lay them out flat. And then we're going to do half at a time, and I'll show you how to make that work. So we have a piece 11 inches wide. We need to find the midpoint, which is going to be 10.5, and mark that. 10.5, 5.5. That's what I was thinking of. There we go. Now we're going to come up to this top edge here, and we're going to mark in 1 inch. That is the very top of the seam allowance of our gore. That's going to give us plenty of room. Then we are going to draw all the way down. If you can't draw because your ruler's not long enough, grab your other one, or just find a long straight edge that is long enough if you don't have those things to hand. Take your time getting those right, and then once you're happy, cut your first side. Now, don't move anything. Keep it all together while we do the second side. If there's any bits that haven't cut all the way through, we'll trim them off all together at the end. Keeping everything as together as you can, slide your work along until you have everything nice and flat to do the other side. And we're going to do the opposite over here. Take a second to line that up because it's come out of alignment a little bit. A little bit is not going to be a problem, just get it as close as you can. We're going to mark our 1 inch. Then we're going to line up our rulers until they match. Then once you're happy, make your cut. Again, we're now just going to check very carefully. Don't change the alignment of these pieces. Try and keep them all together as you gently just check that everything is separate. Anywhere there's any little areas of snagging, just use your scissors to very gently separate them. Now at this point, what you want to do is put some clips down these straight edges to hold them together, because we're going to be sewing them back together along these edges in a little while. And just putting a few clips in now makes it so much easier lining it all up when you get to that stage, because they've not all separated and got confused. So you know you've got two absolutely matching sets of gores here. And there we have two lovely pairs of gores ready to sew. We did it! Woohoo! And there we go. You have now cut out all the pieces that you need for your simple tunic or dress. You've got your main body piece or pieces, you've got your gussets, you've got your 4 gore pieces that are going to be sewn together, and you've got your sleeves. everything you need all done. Phew! Now, I was going to show you me cutting out the woolen one, but this video is quite long enough already, and there isn't a great deal that's different with cutting wool. The only thing to bear in mind is if you are using a strongly directional fabric, like a twill or a herringbone twill, then you may want to make your cutting plan with that in mind. If you've got vertical herringbone stripes, do you want the stripes running down the arms or across? And what about the side gores? You're going to want those running down as well. If you're doing a garment in one of those highly directional fabrics, you may want to buy a little bit extra because your anything goes cutting plan may not work quite as well in that case. You can see what I mean here with this fabric. Because it's a 2-colour twill, even though it's subtle, there is a definite difference between the vertical axis of the fabric, where the white cord is vertical, and the horizontal. Now if you twist that, it just goes in the opposite direction. It's not going to make a massive amount of difference, but for me personally, I like things to flow in a certain way, so I'm going to be quite picky when it comes to cutting that one out. Now, if you have any hints or tips of your own on cutting out, if you've got different methods, please share them in the comments, because my method isn't going to work for everybody. I just thought that I would take you through it and let you know a few of those points that I mark to make it easier later on. And I really recommend you use those. But if you've got other hints and tips, if you work in a different way, please do add it down in the comments. That'd be brilliant. And it may just be exactly what someone needs to hear. Now, the next episodes are all going to be about sewing this together. We're finally there, folks. Woohoo! We're going to start with the shoulder seams and finishing off the neckline. I like to get that done first, because if it all goes a bit wrong and you've sewn the rest of the tunic, you'll be really, really sad. So we get our neckline done before we start doing anything else, and that's what we're going to cover in the next video. Now we are going to take each step by itself. We're going to complete that step before we move on, so that by the last video you'll almost have a finished tunic, and then we will finish them together. Before the next one, I will have my woolen dress cut out as well, so that I can show you the techniques in wool where they vary from linen, and then we'll make the two as we go along together. I'm really excited that we're finally here. I know it's taken a long time, and thank you so much for bearing with me while I've been getting these done through life, the universe and everything. It's much appreciated, and I'm really excited to get to the final stages now. So get those neckline templates ready. We're going to need them in the next episode. If you're looking at me and thinking, what's a neckline template again, go back and have a look at the patterning video. I know it's long, but in the description it's all time-stamped, so you can just skip to the bit that you want. Until then, look after yourselves, have a fabulous day, and I will see you soon. Bye.